Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Approaching Fleet Emissions Reductions Sustainably and Affordably, co-hosted by ACT News and Clear. My name is Patrick Couch, and I'm Senior Vice President of Technical Services at Gladstein Andrus Associates, a renewable energy consulting firm in Santa Monica, California. And I'm looking forward to moderating today's webinar. With numerous avenues available for fleets to reduce emissions, it can be difficult to make the right decision at the right time. Fleets are educating themselves on all the available options to reach current and impending sustainability goals with total cost of ownership in mind. The goal of this webinar is to share how TCO is shaping the way fleets reduce emissions, reveal some of the recent findings from a report on efficiency technology adoption, and discuss how different fueling options can collectively cut emissions and lower costs. Today, we'll be hearing from Mike Roth, Executive Director of the North American Council for Freight Efficiency, BJ Johnson, CEO and founder of Clear Flame Engine Technologies, and myself. Before we get started, here are a few things to keep in mind as we go through each presentation. First, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So I encourage you to submit your questions by using the Q&A box located in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen during the webinar. Please direct your questions to the organizer. There will be a short survey at the end of the webinar that we'd appreciate if you would fill out. Some of the information that will be shared today is technical, so if you'd like to watch it again, an email with a link to the webinar recording will be sent out by early next week. And finally, for any technical issues and assistance during the webinar, please contact Stefan at GNA using the email address you see on your screen. All right, well, let's go ahead and jump into it. So I'd like to continue the conversation here and start by talking a little bit about how I see fleets approaching emissions reductions and sustainability in their assessments. Next slide. So just a little bit of background on GNA if you don't know us. So we've been in the clean transportation consulting space for about 30 years with a lot of experience and focus in the medium and heavy duty transportation sectors, ports and good movement, really covering a wide range of alternative fuels and helping fleets try to navigate that transition from traditional to those alternative fuels. Next slide. So I want to share with you a little bit of GNA's perspective on the evolution of the market here in terms of clean transportation, some of the pressures that fleets face and how they're weighing some of their options. So next slide. First of all, we're at an incredible moment in time. The transportation market is without a doubt unavoidably going through a fundamental transition away from the fuels that it has used for the last 100 years. Next slide. And when we look at what fleets are doing, one of the studies that we prepare annually is called State of Sustainable Fleets. And some of the key findings from those studies last year were certainly around battery electric and hydrogen technologies and the rise in interest in those technologies. But some of the other highlights here really relate to alternatives to those technologies, including renewable diesel and renewable natural gas experiencing record growth in deployments through the support of different clean fuels programs. And CNG and propane really reaching a state of technology and cost where they no longer need funding for adoption, although incentives certainly help the argument. They've really matured to a point where they can operate without incentives. So really meaningful transitions in these non-ZEV options. Next slide. So what are the drivers for the next 30 years as we look out? Clearly regulatory is a driver, right? There are rules, the ACT, Advanced Clean Trucks and Advanced Clean Fleets regulations that are coming in California or already here, and new rules at the federal level. Those are continue to push fleets to transition to new technologies. In addition, and in parallel, there is a massive amount of investment, both public funds and private funds. And at, sort of the heart of it all is sustainability. Right? The whole reason we are doing this and the urgency for the reductions that we need to achieve. Next slide. And you can't really talk about that urgency and sustainability without recognizing the International Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. They just released their sixth assessment report, known as AR6. And there are a couple of quotes that I think really bear keeping in mind as we think about what we're trying to achieve here. One, climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. Very high confidence statement. Second, there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. Very high confidence. What this speaks to is urgency, not the need for perfection, but the need for immediate action. Next slide. And now when we look at the regulatory landscape, there are additional drivers. Next slide. As I mentioned, we have the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation, which has been is being adopted by multiple states. 7 states are working to adopt that, in addition to the 6 that have already adopted it. The California Omnibus Low NOx rule, which places additional limits on tailpipe emissions from heavy-duty diesel trucks going forward. Oregon and Massachusetts have also adopted that, and New York is considering. And then US EPA has announced their own version of essentially a similar new heavy-duty diesel emission standard, which is stringent and a significant challenge. In addition, we have low carbon fuel standards evolving around multiple states in the country. And there is a flood of state legislation and policy initiatives, all driving towards zero emission, low carbon, and other emissions reduction goals. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the Advanced Clean Trucks rule has already been adopted by 6 states, and we see many others looking to adopt that. Now, one thing that I think bears pointing out here is that this represents roughly a third of the country. It means that 2/3 of the country is not falling under these rules. And so there remains a question about what do we do in states where we need to make progress on sustainability, but regulation isn't there forcing the discussion. Next slide. I talked a little bit briefly about the omnibus rule, the California low NOx regulation, and I wanted to put the regulations goals in perspective. So if you think about where we were in 1994 at 5 grams of NOx per brake horsepower hour and 0.1 grams of PM, that's that big gray box in the back. And over the years, we've progressively become more and more stringent, to the point that the new standards are so small they can barely be seen on the chart. We are 2 orders of magnitude or more cleaner today for these new standards than we were 30 years ago. So not only is this a tremendous air quality benefit, of course, but it brings tremendous challenges: technology, cost, reliability, all of these other issues associated with the after treatment technologies that are needed to get us there. And that changes some of the fleet's calculations about total cost of ownership and alternative technologies relative to what would be considered a diesel, natural, or a gasoline baseline. Next slide. And then in addition to that, we have low carbon fuel standards. These are potentially very valuable revenue streams for folks that are using low carbon fuels. Not only do we have the specific programs at the state level in California, Oregon, Washington, but we have a related rule, the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard at the federal level, that also provides incentives for the use of low carbon fuels. And so when you put all of these incentives together, there is pressure to reduce emissions and move away from traditional diesel combustion, and there are a number of incentives towards the adoption of fuels. Next slide. Let's now talk a little bit about some of the sustainability trends we see. Next slide. So all this is happening, or has to happen, in concert with fleets, right? And when we think about some of the largest fleets out there that operate, medium, long haul, regional trucks, heavy duty Class 8 trucks, it's important to sort of ask, what are they doing with respect to sustainability practices? And this is just a quick snapshot of some of the fleets that we looked at. Nearly all of them have formal sustainability reports. Most of them have public goal setting. They are focused on communicating their sustainability efforts to their customers and to their shareholders. Next slide. So why isn't electrification just the default option and solution going forward in what we might think of as sort of the over-the-road truck space? Next slide. There's massive utility investment going in, right? There's billions of dollars coming in from dozens of utilities around the country. Surely that's a signal that the future is electric and it's almost here. Next slide. But when we look at the practicalities of EVs, and I think it is clear that electrification is coming, and there will continue to be investment, but when we look at some of these longer haul operations and we think about over-the-road Class 8 applications, the challenges of electrification start to become a little bit more apparent. One of which is range, right? If we look at the battery capacity of trucks and we make some reasonable assumptions about energy usage and practical daily mileage and end-of-life capacity, you see that we're really looking at probably less than 200 miles a day or at least 200 miles between charging events as a practical limit for a lot of these vehicles. Next slide. In addition, the vehicles are significantly heavier than baseline diesel vehicles, and we have to think about the incremental weight impacts on cargo capacity and displacement of cargo. Yes, there are some weight exemptions that allow trucks to go up to about 82,000 pounds so 2,000 pounds over the standard 80,000 pound weight limit. But this still means that you're potentially giving up 10,000 plus pounds of cargo capacity. And that may not matter for some operators, but for operators typically, including long haul operators that are trying to move as much freight as possible, this manifests as inefficiency in the system and potentially precludes one-to-one vehicle replacements in the system. Next slide. So how does a fleet try to sort of think about all of those impacts and think about cost? We do this through what we call total cost of ownership, and you can see here in the chart a number of the elements that we typically want to think about in TCO. And just a quick comparison of diesel versus EV. EVs are almost always more expensive initially compared to diesel, higher upfront capital costs. Whether there is a TCO savings has a great deal to do with the operating costs over the lifetime of the vehicle. EVs can be less expensive on a TCO basis, but they certainly aren't always, and it has a lot to do with incentives and fuel costs. Next slide. So one of the things we did last year was we compared we conducted a TCO calculation for over-the-road Class 8 markets. We were looking at different internal combustion engine solutions and compared them to sort of the standard battery electric and fuel cell ZEV options. And on a TCO basis, ICEs are more cost effective today than ZEVs. Fuel and maintenance costs benefits of ZEVs can be significant, but they generally don't offset the higher capital cost of the vehicle without substantial incentives for infrastructure and for the vehicles. So if you are in a place where you can secure several $100,000 of incentives to buy down those costs, EVs and fuel cells can make a TCO argument. But without those, you are looking at significant additional costs. And fleets that are motivated to seek GHG reductions under frameworks like the GHG protocol are going to realize similar or greater reductions in their scope 1 and 2 emissions using biofuels like renewable diesel, ethanol, or renewable natural gas than they would from using a battery electric vehicle charged from the grid and at a lower TCO cost. Next slide. So as we look out, as I said, ZEV is coming. Electrification is absolutely coming. This decade is going to be a phase-in of the initial deployments of ZEVs in the applications where they fit and they can make the best TCO arguments. But that's often not going to be regional and long-haul operations. As we get out into future decades, we'll see greater penetration and opportunity. But we have a legacy fleet of vehicles, and we have an urgent need to reduce emissions from the existing fleet. Next slide. So what does that mean when we think about the next decade? Even in California, under California's aggressive emissions reductions plans and ZEV regulations, the forecast is still that we're going to have at least 40% of the existing stock as combustion engines by 2045. And while we will slowly replace that with ZEV options, for the foreseeable future, there is a critical need for biofuels in internal combustion engines and the ability to address legacy fleets. And I think that is a difficult gap that is trying to be filled in the market, and it incorporates some solutions that the fleets are really looking for. Next slide. So I'm going to end my presentation there. I want to transition over to Mike Roth, who, as I said, is the Executive Director of the North American Council on Freight Efficiency, to present some of his perspectives.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. Hello, everybody. I'm really excited to share some thoughts here as we think about this, let's call it decarbonizing freight movement or decarbonization of trucking. So, yeah, excited. Let's go to the next slide. A little bit about us. We are the North American Council for Freight Efficiency, and we are, an unbiased, fuel agnostic nonprofit. We've been at it 13 years. Time sure flies. If you don't know us, everything on our website, all of our output is free and available at either nacfi.org or runonless.com. And there's a lot of good information there, whether you're thinking about, the right tires for your fleet or electric trucks, hydrogen fuel cell trucks. We've got over 50 blogs on automation with respect to, automated trucks. Today, I'm really going to talk about two things as we think about the time here, and maybe I'm going to pull us back in a little bit to the shorter next decade or something like that, that Patrick talked about, and that's to talk about two things that we do. One is our annual fleet fuel study, and then the second is around, we call the messy middle of these powertrain options that are right here in front of us. Next. Yeah, so as we look at and talk to a lot of fleets, and how we do the work at NACFI is we talk to the fleets. They're the ones that are making the decisions around these technologies and how they operate them. They, of course, are being pulled to those decisions by their shippers and their customers up the supply chain. But we also do a lot of work with manufacturers, regulators, other associations and councils, truck drivers, et cetera, with the view on how fleets are making those decisions. So as we sit here in the early 2020s, or maybe it's the late early 2020s, here in 2023, there's a lot of complexity that the fleets are dealing with as they think about this path forward. And so we use this this pie chart to kind of describe the motivators for fleets. And let me walk around it a little bit. I mean, historically, the reason to take action has been on the price of fuel in the moment. So, we've had, 20 years before 20 years ago where fuel was very cheap, under $1 a gallon. And it was basically viewed by fleets as the cost to do business. You just got to have fuel if you're going to haul freight. And then we went through a period of time, say in the last 15 years even, where we had some big swings. We had $4 fuel for 4 years. That dropped down to under $2 for a few months, and then it kind of bounced around back now up around fuel at $4 and up for the last 2 or 3 years. So that's had fleets think about the future fuel prices in their decision making. They can't just rely on that dollar diesel any longer. Now that's like the history lesson on some of these technologies. So let's get more up to date and recent. Regulations have been here to drive some of this decisions. Really, whether that's been pollutant emissions with NOx and PM, as Patrick shared, or more recently greenhouse gas regulations. And I'd like to separate those two for a moment. I mean, greenhouse gas regulations are basically carbon regulations that save fuel. And when you save fuel, you save money. And so fleets are very interested in figuring out how to work within the regulatory environment, primarily on, historically or in the past, been on the truck builders to comply. But now we have regulations that also impact the fleets. And then finally, in an area that, I think is dominating now, and that's sustainability. And so, I've been in trucking 35 years, and, this surprised me and pleasantly, how sustainability has become a driver in shipping goods and buying trucks. It is not something only for what I used to call the consumer-facing brands. It's now, the public and boardrooms and, lots of folks challenging how we move freight, and that's turning up in actions. So the way we see fleets taking action now, and I'm going to have a couple more slides to walk you through this, is, let's burn less diesel right now through efficiency. That, my friends, is decarbonizing. If you use less fuel, you create less carbon, you create less NOx and PM, albeit at tiny levels. But if you burn less fuel, we are helping and we are creating less carbon. The second area that I'll talk about is getting to zero, and these battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell technologies offer a lot of benefits, not only just around carbon reduction, but also around things like noise and simplicity and a few other things. And then finally, consider alternatives. Next. So let me dig into that a bit by looking at these two reports that I talked about. The first is something we've done annually. We actually paused it for a few years, but this is our fleet fuel study. And here we look at a lot of technologies to burn less diesel. And so these are tires and aerodynamics and all kinds of technologies, idle reduction, and on and on. And what we found here next is quite interesting with respect to burning less fuel for fleets to consider. Now, I know these are eye charts, but if you look off to the left, these are 85 technology adoption curves for the past around 20 years. And, you can kind of look at density of the lines a little bit, but you do see that technologies are being purchased at a higher rate. And this is based on a study we've done with 20 trucking fleets that are buying new equipment. And so on all of these types of technologies, whether they're skirts on trailers, idle reduction equipment, maybe a diesel APU or a battery HVAC on your tractor, to different aerodynamic devices, the fleets are buying more of these technologies. Off to the right, there's three fuel economy curves. There's they're all solid ones. It's the red one on top, the blue one on the bottom, and that maroon one in the middle. And so over the course of the last 20 years, the fuel economy of the fleets in our study is the red line. And so you saw the fuel economy dip with the emissions controls in the 2000s. This is EGR and the diesel particulate filters, those things to control NOx and PM. And then we saw a pretty significant, about a 10-year run of fuel economy gains as these technologies that I described off to the left became purchased and utilized by the fleets. And so this is really good news. And we've basically gone up a full MPG from, around 6 miles per gallon to well over 7 with these fleets. Now they tailed off maybe in the last 4 years, you can see there, and we explain that in the report pretty significantly, but we don't see this stopping. We do run on less, and we see 8, 9, 10 mile per gallon diesel trucks out there hauling real freight. So the opportunity is still there. The blue line at the bottom is of note because that's where we report all trucks in over the road goods movement. So this would be tractor trailers, whether they're day cabs or sleepers, but it's all the population out there pulling day cab or pulling dry vans, reefers, and other trailers. And you saw that kind of lay flat for a long time in the 5.9 mile per gallon range until the last few years, when all these technologies are starting to proliferate across all of the trucks that are out there hauling goods. Next. So when we concluded this, basically we have a number of recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's important to have a strategy around saving fuel at the fleets. And this is important around that first strategy I said about burning less diesel. These are tough decisions as you're changing your specs on your trucks, but it's important, and it is a decarbonizing strategy. So I'd like to move to another report that we just published in the last couple of months. This is on the messy middle. So go to the next slide. There are a lot of, all you got to do is open one transport topics, heavy duty trucking, fleet owner magazine, and you'll be bombarded with, what I call a plethora of options around this decarbonization world. And at the high level, you might be able to partition them as, things for internal combustion engines, things for electric vehicles, and things for hydrogen vehicles. And it can be very confusing. And, it's quite easy to say, you know what, I'm not bothering with this. I'm going to hunker down, continue to buy the trucks I buy, the specs I buy, operate them in that way, and I'll worry about this down the road. Well, we submit that down the road's here now with these demands and these expectations that I mentioned earlier in that pie chart. Next. So in 2019, we did some work around, it was actually around electric tractors. And what we concluded in 2019 in this electric tractor, we called it a guidance report, was that electric tractors were coming. Battery electric heavy duty tractors were coming. We've done a lot more work on that to say that they're now here. They're very good in terminal tractors, short hauls, maybe in city beverage deliveries, drayage, and some other things, as well as medium regional haul, we would call it. But what was most interesting about what we did back a couple years ago was we in our work, we concluded that not only were battery electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles the future, but we weren't going to transition directly from diesels to that there was a period of time here that are in decades, not in months or years, until that became, widespread. So we expected and coined the phrase the messy middle, where a lot of opportunities, a lot of technologies were going to emerge and happen and continue over time. Next. So in 2022, we had watched this and we're like, damn it, we were right. That's really happening. Battery electric and fuel cells are progressing as fast as we thought they would, but also we were seeing a whole bunch of technologies emerge in this messy middle. And there's some people, friends of mine, challenged us around, why'd you call it messy? Nobody wants to be involved in a mess. And we are continuing to call it messy because it is challenging time, and it's a high risk, high reward time for making these decisions. So we put a team on it. They spent a lot of time over the last half of 2022, and then at TMC in February, we published this new work on the messy middle. And we recognize that there's a lot of things to consider as a fleet when you're thinking about it. We brainstormed and had 100 or more considerations that fleets have when they're making these decisions, and we summarized them in this that we published. And really, it's just a lot of things to consider as you're looking at making choices and decisions. Next. And with that, so with that, we updated our messy middle bridge, we call it. And, there's some changes here to what we had before, as we're 3 years smarter on it, but we've really confirmed what we thought, and that is that commercial battery electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles off of clean, green, zero emission energy, so that would be renewables, et cetera, is the future, and it's happening and it's coming. And Patrick laid that out pretty clearly. But we also recognize this messy middle as a reality. So things like improving diesel, natural gas, hybridization. Something we missed in the first report is around, utilizing and burning hydrogen in an engine as a decarbonization strategy, and on, including renewable natural gas and diesel. And we put more there because there's really a lot of different ideas, different technologies that are emerging. Some in place right now, burning ethanol in an engine, as pure ethanol in an engine, and some other items that are good decarbonization actions that can happen now as we're progressing. And so lately I've been saying, we can chew gum and walk at the same time. Maybe I don't care which one's which, but chewing gum is deploying and taking advantage of these messy metal technologies while we are walking towards this zero emission future. Next. So we offer a framework for making these decisions. And this is really a three-step process. But first, you see these check marks here. So we're saying start here and consider these zero emission solutions of battery electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cells. And throughout this whole framework, we're asking fleets to think about this. I showed dozens of considerations earlier, but we kind of summarize that in three things: financial, the level of sustainability of the solution, and the availability of the solution. Of course, if any of those three are just a no starter, then you wouldn't make the decision. But if they are available, sustainable, and have making financial sense for you, and really a complete total cost of ownership look, then you should go there. So, the first two, if these solutions, zero emission, make sense, go. And we submit terminal tractors, utility trucks, utility trucks and electric utilities, vans and step vans in urban environments, et cetera. They might be ready for battery right now and should make that decision. If it's not, then you get into this group of three in the middle, and it's really a group of more, but we characterize it as three, and that is natural gas, hydrogen in an engine, and things like renewables, hybrids, and others. So these are those messy metal technologies where you should look at these and really do a study, put people on it, and think about any of those might make sense for us now. And then finally, if none of those, we do not endorse, just keeping on trucking as you always have. There's the ability to burn less diesel with all those technologies I looked at before. And you really ought to do this analysis maybe every year, maybe half year, I don't know, whenever it makes sense, because obviously things are going to change and some of these solutions are going to become more available, sustainable, and financially make sense for you to make that decision. Next. Yeah, I think, as I conclude, and I'm going to turn it over to BJ, that, really time now is for action around these solutions. I think Patrick said it, BJ is going to talk about it too, but now is the time to take action, even if that's improving diesel. Support the fleets in making the right adoption decisions. So diesel was very forgiving. You could buy a diesel truck, you could do a lot of things with it. Now we're talking about, a more high risk, high reward solution in which technology. So we all need to help, whether you're a manufacturer, a consultant, regulations, and so forth. All fleets and others should make realistic understanding of what your pipeline is. Maybe you can't change your trucks from diesel to natural gas to renewable to hydrogen in an engine to ultimately hydrogen fuel cell. There's just too much cost, too much change in your fleet. So really think about that, as well as the truck builders and others thinking about what you're really capable of delivering with this vast amount of different solutions. And then collaboration is really essential. So thanks for your time. I'll be around for questions. I'll turn it on over to BJ now to go forward with some more comments. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Mike. So next, I would like to go ahead and turn to BJ Johnson, as I mentioned, CEO and founder of ClearFlame Engine Technologies. BJ.
Thank you, Patrick. So nice to meet everyone. As Patrick just said, I'm BJ Johnson. I'm the co-founder and CEO here at ClearFlame. ClearFlame, we've thought about this problem the other way around. We believe very strongly that there is a need to take action right now. And we also understand that fleets need to be able to evaluate technologies, and as Mike laid out his roadmap, choose the ones that work for them. But as a technology developer, we have the opportunity to not say, okay, what technologies exist today and how do we make them work, but what new technologies can we develop that can actually meet the needs of fleets. So where an EV or hydrogen does not work, what is that other option between those solutions and diesel with some efficiency gains. I believe very strongly in the two endpoints that Mike mentioned, but I also believe that that messy middle doesn't need to be quite as messy if we're developing technologies that are meeting fleets where they're at in terms of priority. Next slide, talking about sort of in conversations with fleets, the high level concerns that we've sort of heard everyone voice of what is driving their technology decisions and what they want in a new technology. Mike already mentioned three of them. It's got to be financially viable. It has to be sustainable. It has to have a solid environmental impact. And it has to give you the performance that you need to get your jobs done. There are a couple other variables, and I'm going to talk through all of these in more detail, that a lot of fleets have brought up with us in terms of their evaluation of new technologies. That's fuel availability, not just how cheap and sustainable is a fuel, but can I get it in the volumes that I need now, and can I believe in that supply into the future, but also service and operations. This is very different than the passenger car market. As you all know, uptime is a critical metric in the sector, and having a technology that can be maintained and have that high uptime with the existing technician and mechanic base that already exists throughout this country and across the globe is an important part of, again, taking the messy out of the messy middle. So on the next slide, talking about what tend to be the two most important drivers. I think every speaker today has said the same thing: cost and environmental impact. And ClearFlame, our solution in choosing to maintain what is good about the diesel engine, acknowledging that it is a powerful and efficient fuel conversion device, but as Mike was alluding to, modifying those diesel engines to be able to use low carbon fuels like ethanol, methanol, and ammonia is allowing us to unlock very compelling near-term economic and environmental impact. Patrick was sharing some TCO numbers early in the presentation. That was based on 2021 economics. As Mike was saying, fuel costs are a lot higher right now. We're looking at a TCO savings today of being able to use ethanol in a diesel engine that is about 24 cents a mile. So a significant reduction just based on fuel cost alone. And that's not even including the type of economic benefits that you get when you look at states that have low carbon fuel standards, as Patrick was mentioning. So that is not only the lowest total cost of ownership in the market, because it's the cheapest low carbon fuel in the market, even cheaper than diesel, it's also a massive environmental impact. And I appreciated Patrick talking about there really are two axes to environmental impact. Carbon is a big talking point today, as it should be. Climate change is a generational problem that hopefully we can resolve in my lifetime. But there's also still the air quality concerns that we've been worried about for 30 to 40 years. Using these cheap low carbon fuels not only improves air quality, it's effectively eliminating particulate matter, black soot, by reducing it 99% or more. It's actually also a very low carbon life cycle fuel. The fuels that ClearFlame use today, like ethanol, actually offer you a significantly lower carbon per mile benefit than even switching to EV today, as in the fuels we use are cleaner than the grid. That's why we chose the fuel we did, because we didn't want to force fleets to take a step back on their sustainability goals in order to get the economic gains that they need to adopt a new solution. Next slide. And I should also point out that this is not a static target. When you look at where ethanol sits today, depending on who you cite, it's about a 40 to 50% life cycle reduction compared to petroleum diesel fuel, which, as I mentioned, is a lower life cycle impact than EV. But I don't mean that to be a knock on EVs. I think where EVs work, they tend to work well. And I agree very strongly with Mike said that if that's a solution that works best for you, you should absolutely adopt it. And I fundamentally reject the narrative that exists out there that just because the grid is not perfectly clean, we shouldn't adopt EVs right away. I think that's nonsense. And I think the world is coming to understand where we can, we should switch away from combustion to EV and then decarbonize the electrical grid in parallel so we can keep making those technologies cleaner. ClearFlame has the same vision on the liquid fuel space to address the messy middle by allowing applications that need liquid fuels to transition away from petroleum diesel to decarbonized liquids, but also acknowledge that those fleets those fuels are decarbonizing as fast or faster than the electrical grid. We see hydrogen, ethanol, methanol, ammonia, electric vehicles, all effectively in a race to get to life cycle net zero. They're all decarbonizing. And that race is good for the entire economy because it ensures that all these products are going to keep getting better over time. Next slide. So circling back to the top, just address the cost and emissions questions. I also want to talk about the three other critical variables here: the performance, the availability of the fuel, and the serviceability of the engines. On the next slide, we are showing ClearFlame's initial product. We have retrofitted Cummins X15 engines. We have been piloting them with fleets for a while. The next pilots up for ClearFlame are with 5 of the 10 biggest fleets in the country. You can think of this as the Cummins X15, you know, but with some tweaks to it, changing about 10–15% of the parts. But by maintaining the core of that diesel engine power plant, we've been able to validate that this has the same power as a diesel engine. It has the same torque curves as a diesel engine, the same thermal efficiency, the same transient response, the same load acceptance, everything that your drivers have come to expect from diesel, and everything that allows you as a fleet operator to get your job done is maintained in this technology. And that's a very important part of adoptability of a solution. Patrick was mentioning, some of the limitations of electric vehicles. If you only need to go 150 miles between refueling recharging events, you probably want an EV. Or if you're hauling something light like potato chips, again, you probably want an EV. But if you need to be able to go 1,000 miles hauling, the full 49-ish thousand pounds of payload, you need a solution like that to give you what you've already come to expect from diesel. Next slide. Talking now about fuel availability, because I think one of the big missing topics when in the narrative around what fuels that we should switch to, things like hydrogen and renewable natural gas and renewable diesel, those are all great fuels. But the conversation cannot just be about their carbon intensity. The true environmental potential of a fuel is not just a function of its carbon intensity, it's also a function of how much of that fuel exists. Even if a fuel might be 50% better than ethanol, if there is 10 times as much ethanol in the country, which there is, by the way, that fuel is an order of magnitude larger in production volume and scalability than any alternative that we have today, you're going to limit your overall environmental impact. It's also a massive economic risk to not have a fuel that is nationally distributed, as shown in the plot here, and already at scale. To use renewable diesel as an example, every gallon of RD that we make is a good gallon. It is going to help a fleet decarbonize. But if every fleet in the country bets on that fuel, we only have 1 to 2 billion gallons of it to replace the 60 billion gallons of diesel that we have in this country. We're not going to be able to get there with renewable diesel on its own. And starting with a homegrown fuel like ethanol that already has 17 billion gallons of production capacity and has a lot of pathways to doubling that, it's going to be a way to give you the economic certainty and fuel availability that you expect. And finally, on the kind of last background slide here, serviceability. Working on a ClearFlame engine, because it is effectively the same way a diesel engine works today, means that all of the mechanics and technicians out there that know how to work on diesel engines and all of the service shops that are set up to perform maintenance on diesel engines, that is completely compatible with effectively no overhaul or extremely minimal retraining to convert working on diesel to being able to work on ClearFlame. And that means because there's not a massive retraining of the employee base that is out there to maintain these engines, you can actually minimize the disruption for your fleet operation because you don't have to retrain people to work on high voltage electricity or pressurized gases. And again, that is not a reason to delay investment in EV and things like hydrogen and natural gas. I believe very strongly that just like those technologies can't solve the sustainability problem on their own, neither can ClearFlame. We really do need all things, but there is a major advantage in many different duty cycles and fleet operation models where being able to keep your existing technician base really lowers that barrier to adoption. So just over the last few slides here, talking a little bit about where ClearFlame is at as a company. We were started back in 2017 based on some research that my co-founder Julie and I had done at Stanford University out in California. We've been driving trucks around for about 18 months now, have had a wide range of support from groups like the Department of Energy and National Science Foundation, USDA, major investments from groups like Breakthrough Energy Ventures to help scale our decarbonization potential. And now we are getting ready for that opportunity to move from the regional pilots that is shown kind of in a couple slides to working with these large fleets. As I mentioned, 5 of the 10 biggest fleets in the country. On the next slide shows our pilot from Beck's Hybrids, one of the major seed corn producers in the US. We were driving our trucks around, or I guess they were driving our trucks around, showing that they were getting all of the same performance they expected from a diesel engine, but also being able to refuel on a fuel that is very regionally available, not just in the Midwest, but throughout the country. And it's the validation of that pilot demonstration that helped highlight and supplement the TCO study that Patrick did working in conjunction with ClearFlame, but also gave us some of the proof points that we need to scale more broadly in the market. We are, going to the last couple slides, seeking additional fleet partners at this time. The biggest barrier we see to ClearFlame becoming part of the narrative that Mike and Patrick were talking about is just more awareness that this technology is possible, it exists, and can help reduce people's carbon emissions. So thank you very much. Looking forward to the Q&A today. Appreciate the opportunity to share ClearFlame and what we're doing to engineer transformational innovations. And hopefully our solutions, as I mentioned a couple times, are helping make the messy middle a little less messy and ease people's ability to drive better economic and environmental benefits for their fleet operations. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, BJ. I'd like to now go ahead and turn to some questions. If we do run out of time and you're not able to get your question answered, please feel free to reach out directly to our panelists. The emails will be provided in the chat box at the bottom right of your computer screen. So with that, BJ, I'd actually like to go back to one thing that you had touched on, which is the emissions benefits on a life cycle basis. Can you maybe just give a little bit of context about what life cycle emissions are and why it's an important consideration for looking at the benefits of a technology?
Yeah, so life cycle emissions, another way it's talked about is well-to-wheel emissions, refers to the true environmental impact of using energy, any energy resource. So rather than just looking at tailpipe emissions, what is emitted at the vehicle, what did it take to get the energy into the vehicle? So for example, for electricity, while they are zero emissions at the tailpipe, a lot of the electricity in this country is based on coal and natural gas. So there is a greenhouse gas penalty associated with using electrons as it stands today. The same is true for hydrogen today, where it's largely produced from fossil fuels. Now, by the way, that's also true for the fuels that ClearFlame uses. They're not perfect either. While they are biological in nature, so the carbon emitted from our vehicle is biogenic, not contributing to climate change, you had to use fertilizers to plant those crops, and that does actually add to your environmental impact. But it is important that if you are focused on sustainability and not the criteria pollution, where you emit pollution matters. Soot in an urban area is a problem, out in the middle of a truck route, less so of an issue. Carbon is a global problem. It's effectively a massive joint bank account we're all contributing to with these emissions. And we need to look at that life cycle, full well-to-wheel impact, if we really want to understand the impact we're having on climate change.
Great, appreciate that. Thank you, BJ. Mike, sort of a question for you, and this is tied back to some of the performance gains you've seen from your peer fleets in the run-on-less studies. In what ways or via what metrics might fleets be able to drive some value from offering a lower emission transportation service or option relative to their peers or to other industry benchmarks?
Yeah, really good question. Well, first of all, there's been this thing in the industry where, I've got a fuel surcharge, combine that with my comments earlier around, well, fuel's a cost of business, but all that's kind of silly, really. I mean, you should take advantage of those things. But my point is that the connection between what you pay for fuel and what you get in revenue as a carrier are not linked. And not only what you pay for fuel, but how much fuel you use. So why not burn less fuel while you're also gaining the revenue gains that come with high freight movement and even the fuel surcharge? So that's the first answer to your question. But a bigger one maybe, or as big, is where we're headed in the future, and that is that as these sustainability expectations and demands are coming on, there's going to be a collaborative effort here to do that. So I do see early zero emission shipping or goods being moved with the fuels that we've been talking about here will get you business that others won't. I mean, we saw that happen a bit with natural gas in the last decade. I certainly see that here where carriers are going to put out, I've got loads to go from Omaha to Chicago, and I will only do that on certain kinds of trucks. And so if you want to participate in that freight, and that could be at a higher premium on the freight. Now, there's a lot of debate about that, but I think there's a lot of real reasons that we're learning to do this at the fleet level, other than just the government's telling me I have to do it, or some of these other pieces. There are, we're maturing the whole market here into actionable steps that can help the fleet be more successful.
Great, thanks, Mike. And maybe just continuing that theme a little bit, are there any ways that the shipper can be empowered to make better informed decisions about their emissions impact?
Yeah, of course. I mean, shippers can take a look at nacfi.org or runonless.com. I mean, there's a lot of information there that can help them guide their supply chain. And I'd also ask that the shippers, or challenge the shippers, to be more engaged. So, we've heard stories where, a shipper calls up a carrier and says, hey, I've heard all this great things about battery electric trucks. Get me a quote to haul my freight on a battery electric truck. And the fleet says, really, we're not there yet. We don't have the range. We don't have the this. We don't have the that. But wait a minute, shipper, if you could put a charger into your distribution center or your grocery store, and I could get a charge when I deliver there, participate with me and help me in the operations of using these trucks, then we can get somewhere. And too often the shipper's like, no, I'm not getting involved in that. You're my carrier, you deal with that. I think there does need to be some collaboration to move this along, faster. So I think shippers have a lot to play here, rather than just sit there and be demanding on the transformation.
BJ, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing, this is both on the fleet and the shipper, I would say, is kind of think about the problem the way that Mike and I were talking about it today. Think more broadly than just electrification. If you do have an application where EV doesn't make sense, that doesn't mean that you need to just keep using diesel. I mean, there's a couple alternatives. As Mike said, you can not only make diesel better by making freight more efficient to move, there are other technologies out there like ClearFlame, like natural gas, like renewable diesel that can also drive those impacts. And I think better educating shippers, and shippers better educating themselves on the range of solutions, not just this very binary, what I think is a false dichotomy of EV versus diesel. That's going to be the biggest way we're going to help people meet their goals.
So we've received several questions that are all kind of getting to the two questions around electrification. And Mike, I'm going to turn to you for the second one in a minute. The second question, so you can think about it, is when are we going to see EVs in these heavier duty applications? And where are we going to see them first? When can people really start to use them, to book them for shipping, et cetera? The other question is around the availability of infrastructure. And I think this question is being driven by the fleets that are out there on the leading edge, trying to build large scale depots for electrification. And they're running into real challenges on power availability from the utility and the timeline to bring new capacity, right? And what we've learned, I think, at the pilot scale is that when you need a modest amount of power, depending on your location, less than a megawatt, something like that, you can build these things out, right? It might take a year or so to get everything set up, but you can do it. when you try to scale to 25 or 50 or 100 trucks, you're looking at very substantial power demands that have very long lead times on utility supply. And it's all site specific, it's utility dependent. You have to engage those utilities right at the beginning to understand where you're at. I will say that while we've seen some innovative strategies around on-site generation and other ways to try to bridge the gap between the fleet's power demand and the utility's supply capacity, those are really short-term solutions. It's going to take a while for the utility infrastructure to catch up in most places. And I think this is the issue that is being pushed and is most prevalent and sort of top of mind for fleets in California today as they're looking at compliance with the Advanced Clean Fleets rule. So I don't have a perfect answer for you on how you solve that problem right now. I think the industry is learning. And then with that, I'll throw it over to Mike to sort of try to tackle that last question, and then we'll go ahead and close out the webinar.
Yeah, well, I can't help but answer or talk about the infrastructure real quick, Patrick, and that is, you know, we are talking about electricity and increasing electricity and the transmission and distribution of electricity is something we know how to do. I mean, we've done it before, we've done it over time, we've expanded the grid, that we're not creating something new here. Now, yes, there are big challenges with utility commissions and you know, permitting and all that sort of stuff to make it happen. And we are talking about a lot of power for these trucks. Another thing I would mention is, you know, one of the things that gets missed a lot in the well-to-wheel calculation is the transportation of fuel. So it takes a lot of trucks to move fuel around the country, and you know, that doesn't happen once we've electrified a site where that fuel vis-a-vis the electrons, you know, come directly through it when we have that infrastructure in place. Now, back to your question, you really wanted me to answer around waves and early adopters and so forth. And we really believe that, you know, smaller urban trucks, from vans and step vans for e-commerce up through box trucks, medium duty kinds of trucks are ready to go electric now. And the trucks are coming with the OEMs and the battery technology and so forth. Those are trucks with lower miles. They don't require as much infrastructure. Some of that can charge because many of those trucks sit all night long, and they can have slower charging and soften the blow for those that infrastructure. And then you get into the heavy duty tractors, and this is the big point. And so we see short regional haul, beverage, city tractors, as well as drayage and so forth being early adopters. And then getting into that middle mile that people are often talk about, that isn't 500 or 600 miles a day. It's more like 200 to 300, 350 miles a day. I was shocked. I've been at this a long time, but I was shocked at how many heavy duty tractors only go 200, 300, 400 miles and not the 500 or 600 miles that most of us talk about so frequently. Yes, some trucks do that, but there's a lot that are less than that. So that's how we kind of see electric trucks emerge and move forward. And finally, on fuel cell trucks, there comes a lot of complexity and other challenges with fuel cells. So we think in that middle mile area that battery electric trucks will likely win for the most part over hydrogen fuel cell, and hydrogen fuel cell will be kept for the longer, more disparate routes as we look at this zero emission future. A couple of thoughts there, Patrick.
Great, appreciate that, Mike. Actually, I have 1 minute. I'm going to try to slip in one last question, and that was sort of around the question of safety of the ClearFlame technology relative to other fuels like CNG or hydrogen. BJ, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is actually one of the other topics that comes up frequently besides the 5 I highlighted today. You know, just very quickly on the previous question, by the way, you know, I don't think any of us know exactly when EV is going to be here, but the key is, and I think we've all heard ourselves say it, is we don't have to wait. There are solutions that work today, and the solutions that work today have pathways to being carbon negative. So you're not giving up on the future by making progress today, and that should be a real driver to take action. Now, of course, taking action, back to the question, has to be safe. That's a big part of why we chose the fuels we did. Things like ethanol and methanol are basic liquids. They sit in a glass like this. So you can think of those fuels in the same way that you think of gasoline today. So, you know, slightly more flammable than diesel, but if you're comfortable and people do know how to understand work with gasoline as a fuel, this is no different. And that is not a knock on things like hydrogen and CNG, but it is safer in that sense. You know, liquids are simpler to work with, and that's just the reality of physics.
Great, well, I appreciate that, BJ. So we are out of time, so I'm going to have to wrap up the webinar here. I apologize if we didn't get to a question you submitted today. We will collect all these, and the team will respond in the next few weeks. Also, look out for the follow-up email with the recorded link this week, and please remember to fill out the short survey at the end of the webinar. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.